Nobody imagined that Sarah's silence after witnessing the unthinkable would lead her to discover a language more powerful than words in the frozen Arctic wilderness. Her journey from traumatic muteness to profound healing began on the night when screaming sirens shattered her world forever, setting in motion events that would transform not just her own life, but her understanding of what it means to bear witness to truth. Sarah Chen had been walking home from her evening shift at Grind Coffee, a bustling downtown Seattle coffee shop where she had worked for 3 years while pursuing her master's degree in social work. The October night was typical for the Pacific Northwest: drizzling rain that made the streets glisten under streetlights, a chill in the air that promised winter was coming. Sarah pulled her wool coat tighter as she navigated the familiar route through Pioneer Square, her mind occupied with thoughts of the thesis she was writing about trauma-informed care for crime victims. The irony of that focus would become devastatingly clear within minutes. Sarah had just turned the corner onto First Avenue when she heard the first gunshot echo through the narrow streets. The sound was so loud and unexpected that her brain initially refused to process it as what it was, instead cataloging it as a car backfiring or construction equipment. But when the second shot followed immediately after, accompanied by a woman's scream that cut through the night air like a knife, Sarah's body understood the danger even as her mind struggled to catch up. Her feet kept moving, carrying her around the corner, where she saw something that would steal her voice for nearly 2 years and haunt her dreams much longer. 3 men in dark clothing stood over a young woman who couldn't have been more than 22. Her purple nursing scrubs dark with blood, her textbook-filled backpack scattered across the wet pavement like confetti, celebrating a life cut short. The streetlight illuminated the scene with harsh clarity, leaving no detail hidden from Sarah's horrified gaze. The victim was still moving, still alive, her hands pressed against wounds that were bleeding faster than her fingers could stem. She was trying to speak, her lips forming words that Sarah couldn't hear from the distance, but the desperation in her eyes was unmistakable. This was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who had been walking home just like Sarah, never imagining that this ordinary Tuesday night would be her last. The 3 gunmen were methodically searching through the victim's belongings, their movements suggesting this was not their first time committing such an act. They worked with horrible efficiency, dividing her possessions among themselves with the casual indifference of people for whom violence had become routine. One of them was younger, perhaps still a teenager, and Sarah could see his hands shaking as he rifled through the victim's wallet. But the other 2 moved with the confidence of predators who had long since lost any capacity for empathy. That's when the youngest gunman looked up and saw Sarah standing there at the corner, her mouth open in a scream that had died in her throat before it could find voice. For a moment that stretched like eternity, their eyes met across a distance of perhaps 50 feet, and Sarah understood with terrifying clarity that she had just become the only witness to a murder that would change everything. The killer's face was illuminated clearly by the streetlight, a thin scar running from his left temple to his jaw, a spiderweb tattoo on the side of his neck, eyes that held no trace of humanity or conscience. In that frozen moment, Sarah saw not just the face of a killer, but a complete person whose image would be burned into her memory with photographic precision. She could see the brand name on his jacket, the style of his sneakers, the way he held his gun with practiced familiarity. Every detail was cataloged by a mind that understood, even in the midst of shock, that these observations might be the difference between justice and impunity for this heinous crime. The killers ran when they realized they had been seen, disappearing into the maze of Seattle's underground tunnels with a speed that suggested intimate familiarity with escape routes. But the damage to Sarah's psyche was already complete. She had witnessed not just a murder, but a glimpse into the kind of casual evil that existed in the world, the way some human beings could snuff out another person's life for nothing more than the contents of a wallet. Sarah found herself walking toward the victim, as if pulled by invisible strings, her feet moving without conscious direction, while her mind reeled from what she had just witnessed. The young woman was still conscious when Sarah reached her, still trying to speak through lips that were growing pale from blood loss. Her name tag read Maria Santos, nursing student, and she couldn't have been much younger than Sarah herself. "Help," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain on pavement. "Please, help me." Sarah knelt beside her,
pressing her hands against wounds that were bleeding too fast for any amateur first aid to address. Maria's blood soaked through Sarah's clothing, warm and sticky and horrifyingly real in a way that made the entire situation feel like a nightmare from which she desperately wanted to wake up. She tried to speak, to offer comfort or reassurance, but when she opened her mouth, no sound emerged. The words were there in her mind. "You're going to be okay. Help is coming. Stay with me." But they couldn't bridge the gap between thought and speech. Something fundamental had broken in the connection between Sarah's brain and her voice, severed by the trauma of what she had just witnessed. She could only hold Maria's hand and watch the life fade from her eyes while sirens wailed in the distance, arriving too late to save a young woman whose only crime had been walking home from her evening shift.
When the first responders arrived, they found Sarah kneeling beside Maria's body, her hands covered in blood from a futile attempt to stop the bleeding, her eyes wide and unblinking with shock. Detective James Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the Seattle Police Department who had seen every kind of trauma, immediately recognized the signs of severe psychological shock. Sarah's body was trembling, her breathing shallow and rapid, and when he tried to question her about what she had witnessed, no words came from her lips. "Miss, I need you to tell me what you saw," Detective Morrison said gently, crouching beside her in the calm, reassuring tone he had perfected over years of interviewing trauma victims. "Can you describe the perpetrators? How many were there? Which direction did they go? Any details you can give us could help us catch the people who did this." Sarah opened her mouth, tried desperately to form words that could bring justice for Maria Santos, but only silence emerged. The trauma had created a barrier between her thoughts and her voice that no amount of willpower could break. She pointed frantically in the direction the killers had fled, her hands shaking as she tried to communicate through gestures what her voice could no longer express. But when Detective Morrison pressed for the detailed descriptions that could help identify and arrest the perpetrators, she could only shake her head helplessly, tears streaming down her face. The victim was identified as Maria Santos, a 23-year-old nursing student at the University of Washington who had been working evening shifts at Swedish Medical Center to pay for her education. She was the eldest daughter of immigrants from El Salvador who had sacrificed everything to give their children opportunities in America. Maria had been just 6 months away from graduating with her nursing degree when her life was cut short by a robbery that netted our killers less than $40 and a cheap cell phone. The crime appeared to be a random robbery gone wrong, but without Sarah's testimony about what she had witnessed, the police had little to go on in terms of identifying the perpetrators. There was minimal physical evidence at the scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, no surveillance cameras that had captured the crime in progress. The only hope for solving Maria Santos's murder lay in the detailed observations of a witness who could no longer speak. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the trauma specialist assigned to Sarah's case at Harborview Medical Center, explained to Sarah's parents that selective mutism following severe psychological shock was a recognized but relatively uncommon response to trauma. The condition could vary dramatically in duration and severity, with some patients recovering their speech within days or weeks, while others remain silent for months or even years. Sarah's mind is protecting itself from having to relive what she witnessed. Dr. Reeves explained to Sarah's parents, David and Linda Chen, during one of their weekly consultations.
When she tries to speak about what she saw, her brain associates that with the danger she experienced that night. Her silence is actually a survival mechanism, even though it's preventing her from helping with the investigation. Forcing the issue or pressuring her to speak before she's ready could actually delay her recovery significantly. But as days turn to weeks and weeks turn to months, Sarah's silence seemed to deepen rather than improve. She attended therapy sessions religiously, participating in group discussions through writing and elaborate systems of gestures. But her voice remained locked away somewhere unreachable. She could communicate about everyday matters through written notes and basic sign language, but whenever the conversation turned to the night of the murder, she would become agitated and withdraw completely. The investigation into Maria Santos' death continued without Sarah's testimony, but progress was slow and frustrating. Detective Morrison and his team followed up on every lead, interviewed every person who had been in the area that night, and reviewed hours of surveillance footage from nearby businesses. They identified several persons of interest based on similar crimes in the area, but without a witness who could place specific individuals at the scene, they lacked the evidence needed to make arrests. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney James Crawford, grew increasingly frustrated with Sarah's silent witnesses' inability to speak. Crawford was a career prosecutor who had built his reputation on high-profile convictions, and the murder of a young nursing student had generated significant media attention and public pressure for swift justice. Ms. Chen is our key witness, Crawford told reporters during a press conference announcing the arrest of 3 suspects 6 months after the murder. Her detailed account of the events will be the cornerstone of our prosecution. We're confident that once she's able to testify, we'll have everything we need to ensure these killers spend the rest of their lives in prison. But the pressure from the prosecution team only seemed to make Sarah's condition worse. The more emphasis that was placed on her testimony as the key to justice, the more anxiety she experienced when trying to speak about what she had witnessed. Dr. Reeves explained that this was counterproductive to Sarah's healing process, that trauma recovery couldn't be rushed to accommodate legal timelines. But the prosecutor's office continued to express impatience. The media coverage of the case was extensive and often unsympathetic to Sarah's condition. Television news reports described her as the silent witness who holds the key to justice and the woman whose voice could convict 3 killers. Newspaper articles speculated about whether her muteness was genuine or whether she was perhaps protecting the perpetrators for unknown reasons. When the trial date finally arrived after months of delays, Sarah sat in the witness box unable to utter a single word that could help convict Maria Santos's killers.
The courtroom was packed with media representatives, law enforcement officials, and members of Maria's family who had traveled from across the country to see justice served. The prosecutor had arranged for sign language interpreters and had prepared written questions that Sarah could answer in writing. But the defense attorneys argued vigorously that silent testimony was legally inadmissible. The defendants have a constitutional right to confront their accusers, argued defense attorney Margaret Walsh during heated sidebar discussions with the judge. How can the jury properly evaluate the credibility of a witness who refuses to speak? How can we conduct meaningful cross-examination of testimony that isn't actually spoken? Despite the prosecution's creative legal arguments about accommodating witnesses with disabilities, Judge Robert Hendricks ultimately ruled that Sarah's testimony could not be properly evaluated without verbal communication. The jury needed to hear spoken testimony in order to assess credibility, consistency, and the impact of cross-examination. The 3 suspects, Marcus Johnson, aged 19, DeAndre Williams, aged 22, and Robert Chen, aged 24, were released due to insufficient evidence, and Maria Santos' family left the courthouse in tears. The media coverage was brutal, with headlines like "Silent Witness Fails Victim's Family" and "Traumatized Woman Lets Killers Walk Free." Sarah found herself not just blamed for failing to speak, but actively vilified as someone who had chosen to protect criminals over helping a victim's family. Social media was filled with speculation about her motives, her mental health, her character. The narrative that emerged painted her not as a trauma victim, but as a coward who had chosen the easy path of silence over the difficult responsibility of seeking justice. The aftermath was devastating for Sarah's mental health. The guilt of knowing that 3 killers walked free because she couldn't force words past her lips consumed her days and haunted her dreams. Her family, well-meaning but increasingly frustrated by the public scrutiny, began pressuring her to try harder to overcome her condition for the sake of justice and their family's reputation. "You have to understand how this looks," her father told her during one of their increasingly strained family dinners. "Maria Santos' parents lost their daughter, and you're the only person who can help them get justice. People are starting to think you don't want to help, that you're choosing not to speak." Friends who had initially been supportive gradually drifted away, unable to understand why someone would choose silence over speaking the truth in such a clear-cut case. Sarah's job at the coffee shop became impossible when customers began recognizing her from news coverage
and making comments about her role in letting Maria's killers escape justice. The city of Seattle became a prison of judgment and blame, where Sarah could barely leave her apartment without encountering reminders of her failure to help solve Maria Santos' murder.
Dr. Reeves, observing the deterioration in Sarah's mental health, suggested that a complete change of environment might be necessary for her recovery. Sarah needs to be somewhere she can heal without constantly being reminded of what she can't do, Dr. Reeves explained to her parents. The pressure she's under to speak before she's ready is actually reinforcing the neurological patterns that are keeping her silent. That's when Sarah discovered Kaktovik, a remote Inupiaq village on the northern coast of Alaska with a population of barely 300 people. It was about as far from Seattle as she could get while remaining on the North American continent, a place where the murder of Maria Santos would be unknown and irrelevant. The village needed a temporary librarian to help digitize their historical records, a job that required organization and attention to detail, but minimal verbal communication. The journey to Kaktovik felt like traveling to another planet, each mile carrying Sarah further from the life she had known and the expectations that had become impossible to meet. She flew from Seattle to Anchorage on a commercial airline, then took a smaller plane to Prudhoe Bay, and finally a charter flight to the village that would become her refuge. As the tiny aircraft descended toward the landing strip carved from frozen tundra, Sarah pressed her face to the window and saw endless expanses of ice stretching toward horizons that seemed to exist at the edge of the world. The landscape was so vast and empty it made human concerns feel appropriately small, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt something approaching peace. The village itself was a collection of prefabricated buildings and traditional structures scattered along the Beaufort Sea coastline, connected by gravel roads that disappeared entirely under snow for most of the year. Wind turbines dotted the landscape, and traditional food storage structures stood alongside modern satellite dishes, creating a visual representation of a culture that existed at the intersection of ancient wisdom and contemporary survival. The people who met Sarah at the landing strip were friendly but reserved, understanding without being told that this young woman from the outside world had come here for reasons that probably involved healing from something too painful to discuss. They spoke to her in the gentle, matter-of-fact way that people use when they understand survival in its most basic forms. Sarah was given a small apartment above the community center that housed the library, a space that smelled of old books and caribou hide and the lingering scent of seal oil lamps that had been used for generations. The apartment was sparse but comfortable, with a view of the Beaufort Sea that stretched endlessly toward the North Pole, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. Her work involved scanning old photographs that documented decades of village life, transcribing oral histories that had been recorded on aging cassette tapes, and organizing documents that told the story of a people who had survived in one of Earth's harshest environments for thousands of years. The stories she was helping to preserve were filled with accounts of survival against impossible odds, of communities that had developed sophisticated systems of cooperation and resource sharing. The silence that had become her prison in Seattle felt different in Kaktovik. Here, silence was often a natural state rather than an absence of something expected. The Inupiaq people understood that communication took many forms, that wisdom could be shared through observation and presence as easily as through spoken words. They accepted Sarah's muteness without question or judgment, including her in community activity through gestures and shared tasks rather than conversation. During her first month in the village, Sarah learned to navigate social interactions that didn't depend on verbal communication. Community meals were shared experiences where food was offered and accepted through simple gestures, where appreciation was expressed through presence rather than speech. Work projects involved coordination through pointing and demonstration rather than detailed verbal instructions. It was during her third week in Kaktovik that Sarah first encountered Atuat, though she didn't learn his name until much later. She was walking along the frozen shoreline during the brief window of twilight that passed for daylight in the Arctic winter, when she saw a figure in the distance, checking traditional fishing nets through holes cut in the sea ice. His movements were economical and purposeful, each action the result of knowledge passed down through generations.
Even from a distance, Sarah could see that this was someone who belonged completely to his environment, who moved through the Arctic landscape with the confidence of a person who had learned to read ice conditions, weather patterns, and animal behavior with the precision necessary for survival. He worked alone, but didn't seem lonely, content with the rhythm of tasks that connected him to both his ancestors and his environment. Atuat was perhaps 45 years old, with weathered skin that spoke of decades spent facing Arctic winds and eyes that held the depth of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death in the wilderness. His hair was black, streaked with silver, and his hands bore the scars of someone who worked with sharp tools and rough ice every day. But it was his presence that struck Sarah most powerfully, a quality of being completely present in each moment, aware of his surroundings in a way that seemed almost supernatural.
Unlike the well-meaning people in Seattle who had constantly encouraged her to speak, or the frustrated legal professionals who had viewed her silence as an obstacle to overcome, Atuat never showed any expectation that Sarah should communicate verbally. When they encountered each other during her daily walks, he would nod respectfully and continue his work. Sometimes he would gesture toward interesting sights, a snowy owl perched on driftwood, the northern lights beginning to dance across the sky, fresh tracks in the snow that told stories about animals that had passed during the night. Sarah found herself looking forward to these silent encounters more than any social interaction she had experienced since witnessing Maria Santos's murder. There was something deeply peaceful about sharing space with someone who didn't need words to communicate respect, acknowledgement, and even a kind of gentle companionship. Atuat moved through the world with a confidence that came from belonging completely to his environment, and his presence began to teach Sarah that silence could be a choice rather than a limitation. As the weeks passed and the Arctic winter deepened into the profound darkness of polar night, Sarah learned more about Atuat from other village members, though the information came in fragments, shared during communal meals and work sessions. He was one of the traditional hunters and fishermen who still practiced the subsistence lifestyle that had sustained his people for millennia, maintaining knowledge and skills that were increasingly rare even within indigenous communities. His understanding of ice conditions was considered encyclopedic by village standards, and he was often consulted by younger hunters who wanted to learn traditional methods of reading weather patterns, animal behavior, and seasonal changes. He could predict storms days before they arrived by observing cloud formations, could determine the safety of ice by listening to sounds that others couldn't detect, could track animals across vast distances by interpreting signs invisible to untrained eyes. More importantly, for Sarah's situation, Atuat's grandmother had been one of the last traditional healers in the region, someone who understood that trauma could affect not just the body, but the spirit, and that healing often required approaches that went far beyond conventional medicine. Atuat had inherited much of this knowledge, along with a perspective on communication that recognized silence as one of many valid forms of expression. His grandmother, Siku, was known throughout this region for helping people who had lost their voices, explained Mary Eknavigak, one of the village elders. Not just people who couldn't speak because of illness or injury, but people whose spirits had been damaged by terrible experiences. She understood that sometimes the voice goes away to protect the person from having to speak about things that are too painful to put into words. One evening in late November, when the aurora borealis was particularly spectacular, Sarah encountered Atuat while she was photographing the display for the library's digital archive. He was sitting on a piece of driftwood, seemingly content to watch the lights without feeling the need to capture or document them. Sarah approached carefully, and when he noticed her camera, he gestured for her to sit beside him. They sat in comfortable silence for nearly an hour, watching the aurora dance across a star-filled sky with intensity and beauty that no photograph could capture. Occasionally, Atuat would point to particularly spectacular formations, or he would tilt his head to listen to sounds that Sarah was only beginning to learn to identify. the distant call of an Arctic fox, the crack of ice settling in the lagoon, the whisper of wind patterns that indicated changing weather. When the light show finally faded, Atuat turned to Sarah and spoke in a voice that carried the musical quality of Inupiaq mixed with English. "My grandmother used to say that the aurora tells stories for those who know how to listen," he said. "She said the spirits of our ancestors dance in those lights, sharing wisdom that doesn't need words. Some stories are too important to be spoken. They have to be felt directly by the heart." It was the first time anyone had spoken to Sarah about communication that didn't involve verbal language, about stories that were told through experience rather than words. Something in his words resonated in a place deeper than conscious thought, a recognition that she had been so focused on her inability to speak that she had forgotten there were other ways to share what lived in her heart and mind. Over the following weeks, as winter settled into the village, with its profound darkness and bitter cold, Atuat began teaching Sarah about traditional Inupiaq forms of communication that went far beyond spoken language. These lessons happened gradually and naturally, arising from practical situations rather than formal instruction, embedded in the daily activities of survival in an environment that demanded constant attention and cooperation. He showed her how experienced hunters could share complex information about ice conditions through subtle hand gestures, how the position of cached supplies could tell stories about seasonal patterns and resource availability, how the arrangement of stones could convey messages about safe routes, dangerous areas, or the location of resources that might be crucial for survival. In the old days, survival often depended on silent communication, Atuat explained during one of their evening meetings. A hunter might need to share information about dangerous ice or approaching storms without making sounds that could scare away game or alert enemies. My people developed ways of speaking that didn't require voice, ways of sharing knowledge that could travel across great distances and long periods of time. He taught Sarah to read the subtle signs that indicated changing weather, the way snow crystals formed on her clothing when pressure systems were approaching, the behavior of the village dogs when their instincts detected atmospheric changes, the color and texture of clouds at different times of day and what each variation meant for conditions that would follow. More importantly, he taught her that observation and presence could be forms of communication more powerful than words, that bearing witness to life and experience could be its own form of testimony. The way a person moved through the world, the attention they paid to their surroundings, the care they showed for other people and for the environment, all of these were forms of communication that transcended language barriers. "When my grandmother healed people," Atuat told Sarah one evening as they walked along the frozen shoreline under a sky filled with stars, she said that listening was more important than speaking. She said that trauma creates noise in the spirit, and sometimes silence is the only way to hear what needs to be healed. Your silence isn't a problem to be solved, it's a space where healing can happen. Sarah had never heard her condition described in terms that suggested it might serve a purpose, rather than simply being a problem to overcome. The idea that her silence might be a form of spiritual protection, a way for her psyche to process trauma at its own pace without interference from external demands, was radically different from the medical model that had focused entirely on returning her to her previous state of verbal communication. As winter deepened and the village settled into the rhythm of polar night, where darkness lasted for more than 2 months and survival depended on careful preparation and community cooperation, Sarah began to understand that her healing was connected to more than just recovering her voice. The trauma she had experienced in Seattle had shattered her sense of safety and belonging in the world. But here, in Kaktovik, surrounded by people who understood survival in its most basic forms, she was learning to trust life again. Atuat introduced her to other forms of traditional communication that didn't rely on spoken words.
He taught her the drum language that had been used for centuries to send messages across vast distances, the symbolic meanings embedded in traditional Inupiaq designs and artwork, the way stories could be told through dance and movement that conveyed complex narratives without a single spoken word. The drumming became particularly powerful for Sarah. The rhythm seemed to bypass the barrier that had formed around her voice, allowing her to express emotions and experiences that had been trapped inside her since the night she witnessed Maria Santos's murder. Through the drum, she could communicate the horror of what she had seen, the guilt she felt about the failed prosecution, the anger at a system that had blamed her for circumstances beyond her control.
Your silence doesn't mean you have nothing to say, Atuat told her during one of their sessions learning traditional drumming patterns. It means you're learning to say it in a different language. Sometimes the most important truths can only be shared when words get out of the way and the heart speaks directly. As spring arrived and brought the gradual return of daylight to the Arctic, something fundamental began to shift in Sarah's relationship with her trauma. The constant darkness of polar night had created a kind of protective space where healing could happen without interference. And now, as the sun returned to the northern horizon for longer periods each day, Sarah felt ready to begin exploring what recovery might look like. The breakthrough came during a traditional storytelling session held in the community center during the spring equinox celebration, when day and night were equal and the village celebrated the return of light after months of darkness. Elder Mary Agnavigak was sharing legends that had been passed down through generations, stories that explained the creation of the aurora borealis, the relationship between humans and animals, the spiritual significance of seasonal changes. As Sarah listened to these ancient stories, many of which dealt with survival, transformation, and the power of bearing witness to truth, she realized that narrative didn't require her personal voice to be powerful. These stories had been shared for thousands of years, each telling adding new layers of meaning while preserving essential truths at their core. Her own story, the trauma she had experienced, the healing she was undergoing, was part of a larger human narrative about survival and transformation. That night, for the first time since witnessing Maria Santos' murder, Sarah felt something shift in her throat. Not her voice returning, exactly, but a loosening of the tightness that had been there for so long. A sense that the barrier between her thoughts and her voice was beginning to dissolve. She sat in her small apartment and tried to hum, just a simple sound, nothing complex, and was surprised when a faint vibration emerged from her vocal cords. Over the following days, working with Atuat's guidance and using techniques his grandmother had developed for healing trauma-related silence, Sarah began to explore the possibility of sound without the pressure of forming words. She learned to make simple tones, to use her breath in ways that created vibration without requiring complex speech patterns, to reconnect with her voice as a physical sensation rather than a tool for conveying specific information. The voice is like ice on the lagoon, Atuat explained as he guided her through these exercises. Sometimes it freezes so thick that it seems like it will never break up, but when the conditions are right, when the warmth returns gradually and naturally, the ice begins to sing before it breaks. Your voice is singing now, even if you can't hear it yet. The first word Sarah spoke was Atuat, his name emerging as barely more than a whisper during one of their evening walks along the shoreline in late April, when the sun was staying above the horizon for most of the day and the ice was beginning to show the first signs of breakup. The sound surprised them both, and Sarah immediately covered her mouth as if she had done something wrong. But Atuat smiled and nodded encouragingly, understanding that this small breakthrough represented months of patient healing work. Your voice is returning because you've learned that you are safe, he told her gently. Not just physically safe, but safe to be yourself. Safe to communicate in whatever way feels natural. Safe to take up space in the world without having to justify your existence. Over the following weeks, a spring transformed the Arctic landscape from endless white to a palette of browns and greens that Sarah had never expected to see at such northern latitudes. Her voice returned gradually and organically.
She began to speak in simple sentences, then longer conversations, and finally, for the first time since the night of Maria Santos's murder, she was able to tell her complete story to someone who listened without judgment or expectation. The telling happened over several evenings, with Sarah sharing fragments of her experience while they sat beside the lagoon watching the ice break up and listening to the return of migratory birds. Atuat listened with the same attention he paid to reading weather patterns, understanding that this recounting was not just about sharing information, but about reclaiming the power to bear witness to truth on her own terms. When she described witnessing Maria Santos's death, the words came haltingly but clearly, each detail preserved exactly as she had experienced it. She could describe the three killers with perfect accuracy, from the scar on Marcus Johnson's face to the spiderweb tattoo on his neck, from the brand of clothing they wore to the specific way they moved and spoke. Her memory of the event was photographic in its precision, every detail cataloged and preserved. "You were never broken," Atuat told her when she finished speaking. "You were protecting something precious, the truth of what you saw, the memory of someone who deserved justice, the integrity of your testimony. Your silence kept that truth safe until you were strong enough to share it without being destroyed by it." By midsummer, when the sun never set and the village was bustling with subsistence activities, Sarah had recovered not just her voice, but a sense of purpose that went beyond her personal healing. She realized that her experience had taught her something valuable about the different ways humans can communicate and heal, lessons that could benefit others who had experienced similar trauma.
She began working with Dr. Janet Yellowbird, a trauma specialist who traveled to remote Alaska Native communities to develop approaches for helping other crime witnesses who had lost their voices due to psychological shock. Their collaboration combined traditional Inupiaq healing practices with modern trauma therapy, creating methods that honored both the individual's need for safety and the community's need for justice. When Sarah finally felt ready to return to the outside world and provide her testimony about Maria Santos's murder, it was with the knowledge that she carried something valuable, not just her recovered voice, but an understanding of silence as a form of communication that deserved respect rather than pressure. She had learned that healing happens on its own timeline, that safety must be established before truth-telling can occur. Her testimony, when she finally gave it nearly 2 years after the murder, was more compelling than it would have been immediately after the trauma. She was able to describe not just what she had witnessed, but the impact that violence had on its observers, the way trauma could steal voices while preserving memories, the importance of creating conditions where truth could emerge naturally rather than being forced. The killers were eventually convicted based on Sarah's testimony combined with new evidence that had emerged during the extended investigation. Marcus Johnson received a life sentence without possibility of parole. DeAndre Williams and Robert Chen received sentences of 25 years to life. But for Sarah, the convictions were less important than the understanding she had gained about the relationship between trauma and healing. When she chose to remain in Kaktovik rather than return to Seattle permanently, it was because she had found not just her voice, but her place in a community that understood survival in all its forms. Her work with the library had evolved into a broader role as a bridge between traditional Inupiaq culture and the outside world, helping to preserve and share knowledge that might otherwise be lost. She married Atuat in a traditional ceremony that took place during the summer solstice, when the sun circled the sky without setting and the entire village celebrated the peak of the season of light. Their relationship had developed through months of silent communication, through shared work and observation, through the gradual building of trust that happened when two people learned to be present with each other without the need for constant verbal interaction. Sarah's story became part of the oral tradition of Kaktovik, not as a tale of tragedy overcome, but as an example of how healing happens when we stop trying to force recovery and instead create conditions where wholeness can emerge naturally. She had learned that some traumas require silence before speech, that some truths can only be shared when the speaker feels completely safe, and that the most powerful language often emerges from the deepest quiet.
The woman who had lost her voice after witnessing the unthinkable had discovered that silence itself could be a form of communication more powerful than words, and that healing happens not when we force ourselves back to who we were before trauma, but when we allow ourselves to become who we were always meant to be. In the frozen Arctic wilderness, surrounded by people who understood that survival takes many forms, Sarah had found not just her voice, but her true language, one that honored both the power of speech and the wisdom of silence.